Hello and welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share stories where people had encounters that involved mimicry. These stories include a man who had a strange experience while rock climbing with his friends, a mother who shares a scary encounter her children had in their own backyard, and a man who had a chilling experience while walking home from work one night. But first we start with a story from a man who had a terrifying encounter at home one night with whatever was outside seemingly getting inside his house. Before we get started, I just want to say that a lot of people turn to posting their stories online because they feel like they can't tell anyone and would be seen as crazy if they did. Most people who experience these beings are traumatized and feel the need to unburden themselves or just have someone who will believe them listen to their story. If you've had an encounter and you feel like you can't tell anyone for fear of being made fun of, ridiculed, called a liar, or any other reason, email me. You'll find a sympathetic ear here who will believe you. I do want to mention that just because you email me your story, it doesn't mean it will end up in an episode on my channel. Your story can stay between me and you if that's what you want. Also, if you've had an encounter and you'd like to come on an episode and tell your story, email me. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who shared an encounter from December of 2019. His story takes place in eastern Tennessee, where he lives at the base of the Smoky Mountains in a valley. His home is surrounded by dense forest, which covers most of the surrounding area. He says his encounter left him feeling puzzled and even caused him to question his own sanity for days after it happened. He eventually managed to rationalize it and put it out of his mind, but when he read some stories online, he realized that maybe what he experienced that day wasn't that ordinary at all. His story begins on a normal day when he went to work in Knoxville and later drove back home. His roommate, who worked the night shift, didn't get home until later at night. By around 10:30 or 11 p.m., he had settled into bed, turned off the lights, and started to drift off. His roommate was still not home. He had been in bed for about 30 minutes when he was jolted awake by the sound of his roommate's voice. He was at the front door shouting to be let in. Still half asleep, the original poster, or OP, stumbled out of bed and made his way to the front door. His dog slowly got up and followed, wagging his tail as if he were on his way to greet the roommate. Oddly, as he approached the door, the voice seemed to fade, sounding as if it were getting farther away. In his drowsy confusion, he paused to listen, and soon his roommate's voice became so faint he could no longer hear it. It was strange, he says, like he might have gone around the side of the house, probably trying the back downstairs door. He opened the front door and looked outside, but there was nothing. No sounds, and most importantly, his roommate's car was not there. A wave of uneasiness washed over him, leaving him feeling very confused. He called out to his roommate, practically pleading for him to confess that he was playing a prank on him. He was still at work though, with at least 2 hours to go before he would get home. This sent the OP into what he calls a fear spiral, and he convinced himself that perhaps there were ghosts in his home. Every little noise made him jump, but for some strange reason, he felt a sense of calm whenever he stepped outside. The quietness out there somehow made him feel safer, even if it didn't quite make sense to him. He mentions, and I feel it's important to point out, that it was very quiet outside. At one point, he got really scared when his dog began growling and barking, fixated on the door in the kitchen that led down to the basement. He hadn't considered it then, but the door from their backyard that led to the basement was always unlocked. The house was quite old, and they never ventured into the basement, not because it's frightening, but because it's dusty and dim according to him. Nothing else happened that night except for his own self-induced fright, and eventually he was able to drift off to sleep, but with all the lights left on. When his roommate got home, he found it odd but mentioned that the OP was asleep with all of his clothes on and with all the lights still on, with nothing unusual happening after he arrived. I know he said he felt more comfortable outside because it was really quiet, but usually when things get really quiet outside, with all sound ceasing in an instant, it means there's an apex predator nearby. This also usually indicates that there is a cryptid in the area, and with the mimicry that he experienced, that's exactly what I think was out there. Then there is the way he said it moved around the side of the home toward the back door and basement, only for his dog to start growling and barking at the basement door in the kitchen. This, coupled with the fact that they said they left the outside door to the basement unlocked, makes me think that this thing, whatever it was, got into their basement. Not too long ago, I did an episode from a subscriber named Chloe who had a crawler in the basement under her home, which was an older home just like in this story. There was also an outside door to Chloe's basement just like there was here. If I were him, I would make sure to lock both doors to the basement from now on. Also, it could be that he was more comfortable outside because this thing had gotten inside his home. All in all, I'd say he's very lucky that nothing else happened. What an unsettling series of events. What do you think about this one? Do you think this thing, whatever it was, got into his basement? The next story comes to us from Colorado, where the original poster had a bizarre experience while rock climbing with his friends. To give some clarification on what is said during his encounter, he explains the commands he and his friends use while rock climbing. Climbers use a technique called belaying used for their protection. When a climber that is below is not moving, it typically creates tension on the rope, which needs to be removed so the climber above can continue their climb. A belay is placed where the belayer, the climber who sets the belay, is anchored, usually on the ground or a ledge. This is also called a belay station and is where the above climber is suspended. That's the information I was able to gather while looking this up. I hope it makes sense and I didn't butcher it. As it pertains to the story, the original poster and his friends would call out commands to each other when belaying. They would say each other's name and, quote, off belay to let the belayer know to unclip the rope for the slack he could pull out of the rope. The response to this command would be to say the other person's name while adding, quote, belay off. I know that may be confusing, but it is relevant to the story, so I tried to explain it the best I could. During their climb, one of the OP's friends was about 40 meters up on an approximately 50-meter route, though he was unaware of this at the time. The rope had gone still, which is often the case when someone struggles with a move or is busy setting up an anchor, something he assumed was happening. That's when they heard it, a voice that seemed much closer to the ground, almost as if they could have shouted back and forth, and it came from way off to the left where the climber should have been. It called out his name and then said, quote, off belay. He exchanged glances with the other member of their climbing group, both of them equally puzzled. His friend asked him what that was, and they talked about where the climber ought to be at that moment and how it didn't make any sense for them to hear him so clearly. The rope still remained motionless, but he decided to keep it on belay. He thought it was safer to maintain the connection and just let some slack out through his belay device, just in case it wasn't actually him. It turned out that wasn't the case, because moments later the rope began to shift again, accompanied by a soft, measured voice saying his name and then, quote, off belay, which came from a direction which sounded much more appropriate. They didn't think much of it at the time, but as they descended the wall, they explored a few routes without encountering anyone. Just a few months prior, a friend of theirs had a close call when someone took him off belay while he was in a precarious position. He also recalls watching a video of a hiker down a road when he suddenly heard a woman's voice urging him off his path. He paused, trying to make sense of the situation, but ultimately decided to leave because it was so unsettling. He ends by asking if there are any cryptids who can mimic a person's voice. One commenter replied to the story with a strange occurrence of their own, documenting a similar experience where he thought he heard his wife's voice calling him by his nickname. Her voice called out to him twice while he was in the shower. Curious, he stepped out to ask if she had called him, but she said it wasn't her. As he returned to the shower, he once again heard the voice, and this time it seemed to chuckle. It was only then that he realized the sound was coming from the bathroom window facing the shower. To answer the original poster's question, there are many cryptids that can mimic voices, with some that may even surprise you if you are new to the channel or just haven't come across the information before. These cryptids include, but are not limited to, wendigos, skinwalkers, wachuge, goatmen, crawlers, and even Sasquatches are said to be able to mimic. The stories where this phenomenon comes into play the most would have to be wendigo and skinwalker stories, where people often report hearing mimicked whistling, screaming, crying, and voices calling to them and sometimes their pets in a familiar voice. They often use the voice of a relative, friend, or someone close to whoever is hearing it, and sometimes the person having the encounter even hears their own voice calling out to them. It's the most common technique these cryptids use to lure people out further into the wilderness where they will be easy prey. The mimic in this story seemed to want to cause them harm by calling out the wrong command, seemingly in hopes of someone getting hurt or worse, which points to this thing's intentions. I'm just glad the OP and his friend weren't tricked by whatever this was and waited until they heard the right person calling out the command from the right direction. In any case, whenever a mimic is involved, it's very creepy and they usually have bad intentions. What do you think about this one? And what would you do if that happened to you? The next story comes from a poster who shares 2 scary experiences her children had with something calling out to them from the forest around their home. This happened twice before the original poster shared her children's story online. It involves a trampoline they got not long before these weird things began happening, and they enjoyed jumping on it even at night. One night while her children were outside, they heard whistling and voices coming from the woods at around 10 p.m. She can confidently say that no one ventures down there, especially not during hunting season. This really spooked her children and they rushed in to tell her. It's also worth mentioning she says that they have a cat who sometimes escapes, prompting them to search the yard while calling her name. On another occasion, her son was outside at dusk looking for the cat near the edge of the woods. He was alone with his sister inside when he claimed he heard her calling his name from the woods twice, followed by giggling. The whole ordeal, according to her, was incredibly unsettling. In an effort to get to the bottom of what's going on, she considered getting cameras for the yard. She closes by saying she isn't sure what's happening and asks for thoughts about what her children heard. One commenter shared a story of their own, an encounter that happened when he was in first grade at a school that was right next to a patch of woods. It doesn't seem to involve cryptids, but it is interesting nonetheless. He vividly recalls playing outside during recess when he spotted his grandfather and uncle waving at him from the edge of the trees. He remembers being very happy to see them and was ready to rush over to them. That's when he heard his teacher calling his name and turned to look at her. When he glanced back at the spot where he saw his grandfather and his uncle, they were gone. He says he can still vividly remember seeing them standing there, and they looked like they were surrounded by a magical glow. Nothing is scarier than cryptid encounters that involve children, and I hear so many where the cryptids come right up to their bedroom windows and try to lure them outside at night. There are even cases where parents catch their children trying to go out in the middle of the night to play with the quote bear, quote big hairy man, and even the quote big dog. There are a lot of missing 411 stories where children go missing under mysterious circumstances, and when I hear stories like this one, it makes me wonder if some of them involve mimics. After listening to so many 411 and cryptid stories, I have no doubt that cryptids are behind some of the disappearances I hear. There are occasions where the children do turn back up days or even a week or two later in impossible locations up mountains or very far away. At distances no child the ages of the children who go missing in these stories could possibly travel. And it's usually several miles in a matter of hours or farther in a matter of days. And these distances usually involve rough terrain and varying elevations no child under the age of 10 could possibly cover. I've even heard stories where the children tell how they were taken care of by a quote bear, but the way they describe these bears sounds more like a Sasquatch. One in particular comes to mind when one child was talking about how the bear gave it berries. The bear held its hand out, palm up, with berries in its hand, which is impossible for a bear to do. I'm just glad the children in this story didn't follow the voices or fall for the mimicry. And I'm glad the commenter was distracted by his teacher before he could run to whatever it was posing as his uncle and grandfather. There's no telling what would have happened to any of them if they did follow those voices and or people posing as relatives. One last thing I want to mention about this one is the son hearing giggling after hearing his sister's voice coming from the woods. This makes me think that something sinister was afoot, and it even was giggling at his reaction to hearing his sister, knowing full well that she was inside. I'm sure he had a puzzling look on his face which prompted whatever was out there to giggle. Either that or maybe it was trying to lull him into a sense of complacency and lower his guard. I'm just glad that he knew his sister was inside at the time and did not follow the voice. What do you think about these stories? Have you ever heard voices calling out to you from the woods at night? The final story of this episode comes to us from West Texas, where one user had a bizarre experience while walking home from work one night. He worked in a restaurant that was located on a mountain in a national park. There was a trail leading to the restaurant from the housing where he was staying at the time while working there. It was about a 15-minute hike each way. For 3 years, he searched for stories similar to what happened to him, but only found one close just before posting his story online. The only difference, he says, was the voices that were mimicked, which made him think whatever this thing was had been watching him and his friends for a while in order to perfectly replicate them. He wanted to post his story for a while, but he would get very uncomfortable while trying to write it out. But when he found an encounter similar to his own, he found it cathartic and decided to share his story in hopes that it might help someone and let them know that they are not alone. Each night he would close up the restaurant and walk down the hill about an hour or two after everyone else. The path was typically deserted and eerily quiet, with little chance of running into anyone else, being that all the establishments at the mountain's summit were closed by that point. There also wasn't a reason for anyone to be on the trail at that hour. The night of his encounter, as he made his way down the mountain, the absence of moonlight left the trail in complete darkness. It was empty and, as usual, very quiet. Just as he was about to veer off the path to take a shortcut through a thicket of cacti and brush, he suddenly heard his best friend and roommate call his name from the opposite direction. His voice was unmistakable, clear as day, and when he turned to look, his friend's voice called out again. He mentions that in hindsight, there was something peculiar about the way it sounded. It was as if his voice was recorded from a distance yet played back right next to him. It felt strange and almost monotonous, but not enough to raise immediate alarm. Then, as he was standing about 50 yards away from his house, a voice suddenly came from his left, from the foothill of the mountain they sometimes hiked. The area from where the voice came was densely packed with trees. He says that if you took just 5 steps toward the source of the voice, you'd vanish from sight of anyone on the trail or on the back porch of his house. When he heard his friend's voice calling him, he thought it meant they were going on a night hike, so he started to move in that direction. But just as he was about to step into the trees, he heard his friend's real voice coming from the porch asking who he was talking to. That stopped him in his tracks and he turned back toward the house, completely bewildered. That's when he saw it. This terrifying creature burst out of the thicket he was about to walk through, right from the very spot he passes by every night. It was humanoid in shape, but very tall and incredibly thin, too skinny for a human according to him. By his estimation, it was easily 8 feet tall, was hunched over and sprinting as if it had just taken off from a starting line, maintaining an awkward posture the entire time without fully standing up. Being that he is colorblind and struggles to distinguish between greens and yellows, he says this thing had a strange mix of both. It also seemed to emit its own glow, which he says sounds utterly ridiculous, so he usually only shares that detail with people who he trusts completely. Their back porch light was on and the creature was positioned where the light would have illuminated it, so if it was translucent, it could have reflected the light. but he says it felt like it had its own faint glow similar to a dying glow stick, enough to see but still quite dim. In any case, the light had not been there just moments before he took the shortcut, and it would have been noticeable for at least 50 yards of his walk. He adds here that it's important to recognize that if he had followed the voice, two significant outcomes would have unfolded. First, he would have vanished from anyone's sight entirely, and second, he would have turned away from whatever that entity was, walking into the thicket of trees, weeds, and cacti so dense that escape, confrontation, or any form of retreat would have been impossible. That direction would have taken him straight to the edge of a cliff, known as the Window in Big Bend National Park, which plunges a staggering 6,000 feet into the vast desert below. He wonders if that could have been this thing's intention behind trying to lead him in that direction, and says that would have been an ideal location to lead someone if they had sinister intentions, because no one would easily find them, if at all. He says that even in broad daylight, it would have been entirely feasible to make someone disappear there. The moment this thing took off, it felt to him like it was startled, but it was different in that this thing, whatever it was, seemed almost sentient, fully aware of its own movements rather than just reacting by instinct. It was like scaring a person who had been lurking in the shadows, according to him. He also took off running, turning his back on it, and as he sprinted to his back porch, his friend, who was still standing there when he arrived, was utterly confused and was asking him who he was with. His expression was a mix of confusion and concern as he kept glancing past his friend. The OP asked him if he had heard it too, and his friend told him he did and asked him where all the people who were with him were at. This left the OP dumbfounded and asking him if there was more than one thing out there with him. It turns out that his friend heard more than one voice along with his while he was still on the trail. His friend told him that they were laughing and loudly talking. He heard 3 distinct voices other than the OP's and thought there was a whole crowd coming down the mountain. He heard the supposed group for several minutes before seeing the OP and thought he had encountered a group of hikers while walking home. It took some time for him to convince his friend that it wasn't a prank and that he had been on the trail alone. In fact, he says as he was walking down the trail, he hadn't spoken a word. Whoever his friend thought he heard definitely was not him. But during his walk down the mountain, he was praying intensely. There had been this heavy, dark energy in the house lately, and he was trying to fill himself with light and positivity, asking God for strength before he went inside. Then, out of nowhere, while he was on the trail, he felt this incredible wave of joy wash over him. He was practically screaming with happiness on the inside and feeling invincible. He says he believes that the feeling had a connection to how the night unfolded, rather than how it might have gone otherwise, and really doesn't think it was just a coincidence. He's just trying to figure it all out and says every little detail matters. The last thing he mentions is that out of the blue he found himself not thinking about his encounter anymore. It wasn't that he forgot, it felt more like it was shrouded in a dense fog in his mind. The next day he recounted the tale to a friend and she surprisingly cut him off, telling him that him and his friend, were crazy and just getting scared in those mountains before walking away. He says it was so out of character for her to dismiss someone, especially a friend, without even letting them finish their story. He describes her as a genuinely compassionate person, but says it felt like she had heard something in his story that triggered a memory she didn't want to confront, and she shut it down before it got too close. He does say he could have just overanalyzed it, but this has happened a few times with telling his story. Plus, they had been living on that mountain intermittently for several years and had never encountered anything even remotely like this incident. Until that night, they hadn't even heard a story that came close to resembling it. He closes by saying it wasn't that they were scared of their own home or the path they walked down every day, twice a day. And it wasn't like they were imagining things based on the stories they had conjured up in the dark. But the strangest thing happened the moment his friend who dismissed his story turned to leave. It felt as if a thick fog rolled in, clouding his memory, and the last time he truly thought about it was right then. After that, it vanished for months. He asked how something so significant and terrifying could occur in his life, and then he could just stop thinking about it. Then, out of nowhere, it resurfaces again. He was genuinely shocked and puzzled about how he could have just forgotten about it for so long. It was almost more perplexing than the actual events he experienced. Just before he posted his story online, he asked his friend if he felt the same fog, and he replied, absolutely. He's not a fan of discussing that night, and he's made it clear, but the OP can't help but bring it up whenever he can, hoping that by talking it through, they might uncover some explanation for what happened. Even as he was typing his story, he felt like he had asked him countless times before and just couldn't recall his answer. He adds that maybe his friend did forget and says forgetting things like that isn't all that unusual. He finishes by saying he's honestly at a loss with all of this. The only thing he has are the details from that night and some strange memories that followed. He says he's never really known how to process it. However, a post from another user he saw a few weeks before he posted his story really helped him after 3 years of wrestling with what happened. Just seeing something that resonated with his experience has made him feel like he's figured it out as much as he's comfortable with. He thought perhaps someone else might be feeling the same way he did and still does about his encounter, and could use a bit of reassurance or just a little validation. I have to say that this is one of the most bizarre mimic stories that I've heard. Not only did he hear a voice being mimicked and see a tall, skinny humanoid run away, but his friend heard multiple voices and thought he was with a group coming down the mountain. It's no surprise to me that this story takes place in a national park, as there are so many strange and unsettling stories that come out of parks around the US. And not just cryptid encounters either, but also paranormal stories and missing 411 cases. It makes me want to stay away from national parks, especially after all the stories that I've heard. I also want to mention that his friend probably saved his life by calling out to him when he did, because the OP was on his way into the dense foliage to follow the mimic's voice. Had his friend not called out to him from the porch, we probably wouldn't have heard his story given his description of the area where he said there was a cliff. Then there was the creature he saw run out of where he was about to go. I don't think it would have ended well for him if he did follow that voice. One thing that stuck out to me was how he described the humanoid creature he saw as being sentient, like it had intelligence to it. This is something I hear in a lot of cryptid stories, and it makes me think that he saw a cryptid that night. I mean, they would have to be intelligent to be able to go unnoticed, and especially to mimic people. The fact that they have intelligence throws a lot of people off because they have always been portrayed as mindless creatures. But the more we learn about them, the more apparent it is that this is not the case at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Another thing that struck me about this story was how he describes forgetting the incident like it just slipped away from his memory rather than he and his friend repressing it. He would vaguely remember it, then have it come back, only for it to fade away again. That in itself is bizarre. I've heard stories where cryptids affect people's heads and even appear in their dreams. I've heard stories where people are walking along a trail, then see a cryptid, and the next thing they know, they're walking out of the forest at the trailhead with no recollection of how they got there. This really makes me wonder if this thing does something to their minds to make them forget about what they experienced that night. As for what he saw running away, I can't say for sure what I think it could have been, and I won't venture a guess as to what its intentions might have been either, but I don't think it was anything good. I'm still very intrigued by the fact that he only heard one voice while his friend heard many. It makes me wonder if there was more than one thing out there that night, or if this humanoid creature he saw was capable of producing that many voices at the same time. What do you think about this story? And what do you make of him hearing only one voice while his friend heard many? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.